Continuing on the Shabbatai Tzvi situation, the aftermath, the pursuit of heresy, and I'd like to just comment on that. I highly recommend her book. Those of you that haven't read it, are there any here tonight?
I actually came here, I realized this is being said on tape. I've never been late in my life. I came here, I realized I forgot some books, and I went back home to get them. Afterwards.
Well, there are some books here after the lecture. I highly recommend them. Very informative and insightful.
Such a great sales pitch, if I would have known. Take a deep breath. Okay. No. You know, for a yeket to be late, it's a very traumatic thing. It's not... in the Beit Knesset where I grew up, they say, why are the doors so wide? Because everybody shows up at the exact same time. For those of you that are concerned that one ought to be home preparing for Shavuot, one should know that it's not completely disconnected from what we're doing here tonight, because Leil Shavuot was considered by the Shabtaim to be a big night for Nevuah, for revelation. It was the night of Matan Torah. They dated Natan Ha'azati's prophecy to Leil Shavuot. That was the night on which Shabtai was revealed to be the Messiah. And as we're going to see, there were other figures, such as Ramchal, for whom Leil Shavuot was also very, very important. So it's not completely without reason that we're gathering here tonight to discuss this topic. Last time we discussed a messianic movement, an open movement in which a person declares himself to be Mashiach, and many people in the Jewish community follow. Tonight we want to look at something different, equally important, equally deserving of a rich place in Jewish history. Tonight we want to look at something that really deserves the name polemic. Now, usually we say a polemic and we intend or we refer to a bitter opposition between two opposing beliefs or credos that cannot have any mutual reconciliation. We talk about the Jewish-Christian polemic. There is no meeting ground. Each one has some argument against the other, and there is no reconciliation. And that term is really appropriate. It's not just a machloket. Jews know how to live with machloket. Where do you go back in our sources and not find machloket? But there are machlokot where we can say, Elu ve'elu divrei Elokim chayim. We can live with the opposition. We can live with the other side. We can disagree and yet agree that we all belong to Klal Yisrael. In this case, that is not what happened. In the case of the polemic, of the pulmus over the matter of Shabtai Tzvi, and over the various permutations of belief in Shabtai Tzvi, there was no room for reconciliation. There was no meeting ground. We're talking about two sides who stand in absolute opposition to one another, and we're going to look at their positions. And there were voices that said, let's make peace, let's have harmony. But that's not what we're going to look at. We're going to look at the voices that said there can be no peace. It's impossible to integrate such views into Yahadut. And we've had such polemics at other times too. Look at, for instance, the movement of the Hasidim and the early opposition, which said there is no room for them in Klal Yisrael. Look at the rise of the Reform movement and look at the opposition to it, which said this has no room in Klal Yisrael. So this is not just a machloket. This is something stronger than that. This is something which is going to have an influence over how Jews take positions in the future as well. Unlike the Messianic movement, which focuses on the personality of one figure, Shabtai Tzvi. When we're talking about a polemic, and in this case one which lasts for centuries, talking about a series of figures, different figures at different times and with different issues, each of whom take positions. They never gel into a formal movement. There's no name we could conveniently give to what we're looking at tonight. If you look at the opposition to Chassidut, you could call it Hitnagdut, and everybody knows what you're talking about. If you look at the opposition to Reform, you could say Orthodoxy, and everybody knows what you're talking about. Here we simply have anti-Shabtaut, anti-Sabbatianism. The opponents never formulate one coherent policy or one coherent ideology against the Shabtaim. But the Shabtaim have a very coherent sense of self. As we will see almost from the beginning, they call themselves Ma'aminim. And they call their opponents Kofrim. No room for both of them to live together. In some cases, even though there is no coherent ideology that's passed on within a community, in some cases it gets passed on within families. And you have first families of anti-Shabtaut. In the Sephardic world, you have the Chagiz family, where you have Rabbi Yaakov Chagiz, who was at the time the Rav Rashi of Yerushalayim, who was a contemporary of Shabtai and a teacher of Natan, and who passed on his opposition to the movement to his son, Rabbi Moshe. In the Ashkenazic world, you have great figures like Chacham Tzvi Ashkenazi, who passed on to his son, Rabbi Yaakov Emden. So you have families in which you have a tradition of kana'ut, of zealotry against Shabtaut, but you don't have one coherent philosophy, and you'll see that the arguments change, the strategy changes, depending on the time and the place and so forth. Of course, the question that you have to ask each mitnaged, each opponent of Shabtaut is, how do you define Shabtaut? How do you define Sabbatianism? For our first opponents of the Messiah, it was very easy. They didn't believe his messianic claims. But what do you do a century later when you have figures, and I'm speaking about figures especially and most poignantly, figures of people who are clearly Gedolei Ruach, such as Ramchal, Rabbi Moshe Chaim Luzzatto, such as Rabbi Yonatan Epshitz. No one can deny that these were giants of spirit. I don't believe that anybody caught either one of them ever in any public violation or flagrant violation of any Jewish law. Where do you draw the line? How deeply inside someone's psyche are you permitted to probe to say this person is still michutz lamachaneh? He does not have a place in Klal Yisrael. Let's begin with the genesis of the anti-Sabbatian movement. Let's begin with the person who was the very first opponent, the first rabbinic person to stand up against Shabtai Tzvi and say, can't be, I don't believe it, was his own Rebbe in his native city of Smyrna, Rabbi Yosef Iskapa, who said, I know him, he isn't the Messiah. Now, it seems funny, but personal relationship with Shabtai could have worked both ways. In the case of Iskapa in Smyrna, in the case of Rabbi Yaakov Chagiz, who was the Rebbe of Natan Ha'azati, Again, you have the same thing of Ein Navi Be'iro. People who knew them closely enough to be able to say, we know them, we taught them, they sat in our Beit Midrash, and we know they are in what we've been waiting for all these millennia. It could also... Yes, well, that's what we have. Ein Navi Be'iro comes from, yes. But then you have somebody, and here I'm going to come to your question of naming names. Then we have somebody like the chief rabbi of Aleppo, who met with Shabtai, and who became his lifelong admirer and adherent, and was one of the most important disseminators of Sabbatian propaganda. We'll come back to that. But it could work both ways. You could either become so impressed with his person, and he was supposed to have been an imposing-looking person and a charismatic person with a beautiful voice. What more could you want in a Mashiach? Some people really felt he has it. He has that aura. And personal meeting meant something. It meant a lifelong connection with him. So many of those inner circle members in the first generation had met him. And that didn't turn them off. But for others, the personal meeting was death. That convinced them that he was perhaps confused, that he didn't know what he was talking about, that he was not the real thing. So it could work both ways. But the very first public opponent, which goes back all the way to the 1640s, when Shabtai first began to have some sort of manifestations. There isn't even a claim yet then that he was the Mashiach, but he was doing certain things in public. He was pronouncing the Shema Meforash, and that had messianic associations. And there you already have your first pronouncement against him. What year was he born? Shabtai was born in the 1620s, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah. But the date usually given, we don't really know for sure when he was born. He claims to have been born also on a special day, Tisha B'Av, because that's the day that in the Talmud the Mashiach is supposed to have been born. Whether or not he was born in this year and this day, we don't know. At any rate. But we know almost nothing of Eskafa's opposition, because he didn't write it down for posterity. And such are the vagaries of history, that unless something is preserved, and sometimes it's just a matter of luck, we don't have any record, we don't know. And that's why the first opponent, whose work I want to look at with you tonight, Rabbi Yaakov Sasportas, is so important. Because everything went into his notebook. Many Rabbanim kept what you might call in English an epistolarium, a record of every letter, every igeret. This is how we have the She'elot U'Tshuvot. They kept copies not only of what they wrote, but of what they received and their answers. And Sasportas was the first to realize that the whole event surrounding Shabtai Tzvi had historic importance. And he began to actively seek information. He didn't just wait to hear rumors and news. He began to seek in a systematic way every report he could find. He judged for himself and, of course, found Shabtai lacking, found him wanting, and we'll look at what his criteria were for making that judgment. And so he kept, not just until Shabtai's apostasy, but until his death in the 1680s, Sasportas kept a record of everything that occurred and every letter that was sent to him and every letter that he sent out. And he kept it in a collection which he called Tzitzat Novel Tzvi, which was not published in full until this century. Rabbi Yaakov Emden published a an abbreviated or abridged version. It wasn't until Yeshaya Tishby put out a full annotated edition that we had the entire scope of Sasportas activities. And it's really an amazing document. Nothing of the little excerpts and snippets that I sat and snipped out can convey a sense of how wide-ranging his activities were. Even what he preserved is not a fraction of what he was involved in. He sometimes says, I've already written to you X number of times, and we have to imagine what he said those other times. And it becomes an important record for two things. It becomes an important record for Sasportas activities. It becomes an important record for our knowledge of opposition to Shabtaot, and it's also the most important record we have of the movement itself. In fact, such is the way things work, that almost everything we knew about the movement until very recently, we knew from the words of its opponents. Because Sasportas set up a very high standard of preserving with great fidelity, or with almost great fidelity. We could talk later about the question of how exact he was in what he preserved for posterity. But in large measure, it's as accurate as anything you're going to get. And that set up a tradition, so that when Rabbi Moshe Chagiz, a half a century later, preserves more evidence from a different period, again, with great exactitude, every letter, with every date, with every text, neatly and clearly preserved. And this is how we know about the continuing activity, not just of the anti-Shabta'im, but of the Shabta'im themselves. Let's look for a moment at the very first page in that little handout. Okay, all of this on the first column is from Tzitzat Noveltzvi. Yes. Yes, he's a fascinating figure. Rabbi Sasportas was born in North Africa, in Oran. And he had to leave there because he was involved in political things against the Portuguese government. He found himself on the wrong side. He was a very powerful person. At age 18, he became chief rabbi of his city at 18 years old. And he had to leave. And where he goes to after North Africa is Western Europe. And I think what you find in his biography, this coming from someplace in the more traditional Middle East. You have him coming from North Africa. You later have Moshe Chagiz coming from Eretz Israel. Going to Western Europe is itself a pattern that might explain some of what moved them to such opposition. Imagine what it's like coming from a Moroccan city where the Chacham was as close as you could get to the absolute authority, and to come to cities like London, Amsterdam, each of where he could not get a job. They had Chachamim, and there was simply no position for him. He ended up being a proofreader in the printing press of Menashe ben Yisrael, not Lefich Vodo, not something that he anywhere commensurate to his abilities and to the kind of kavod he had back home. Kavod harabbanut becomes the motif of his career, and very much underlies all his arguments. He feels that Shabtai simply does not live up to the criteria that the Rabbanim taught, and that alone is enough in Sasportas' eyes to repudiate him. Okay. I picked out little bits from the beginning here is an account that he writes of his very earliest activities when news of Shabtai begins to come into Western Europe. He writes, and I'm just going to read some little pieces that I underlined there. V'tekef katafti ktav sheni la'Amsterdam v'chachameha. Again, we don't even have the ktav rishon, but here he's telling us that he wrote a second time. Why did he write to Amsterdam? Because in Western Europe, Amsterdam was considered the capital, especially in the Sephardic world. Shera'iti otam mikaimim et hanishma. They were already giving their seal of approval to the nishma, to what was just a rumor of Shabtai Tzvi. They hadn't even seen him. They hadn't even met him. They hadn't even talked to him. This was Sasportas' already implied criticism. How can they affirm his being the Mashiach without having seen him? V'sholchim l'chol ha'aratzot lehazhiram al kiyum ha'emunah hazot. And from Amsterdam, they are already writing to all the rest of the world. What?
Very strange that Amsterdam doing that.
It's not strange because, remember we read that little excerpt last time from Glickel. We're going to look here on this very page at the bottom at what a possible motive Rabbanei Amsterdam could have had for jumping in so quickly. You'll read it and then maybe you'll understand a little bit better. But Sasportas was horrified. And he says, B'tchilat haktav, I'm reading just the underlined portion, Shitafti atzmi imahem b'simcha. He says, I feigned joy. I made believe. I agreed with them and was a participant in their joy. Why did he have to make believe? Well, this tells you something about how high the tensions ran even from the very beginning. You were either a ma'amin, notice in that second line that we just read, al kiyum ha'emunah hazot. It's already a faith. Belief in Shabtai almost from the beginning was considered to be an article of faith. And he's saying it was so strong a faith that I knew if I wanted to elicit information from them, I had to dissemble. I had to trick them and deceive them into believing that I was on their side, and then they would share their information with me. And we could read the whole thing, but I'm not going to. Go to the middle where I underlined some other lines. He writes, I have to express, after saying how happy I am to hear the news, I must say that maybe we should be a little bit more reserved. Maybe we shouldn't jump in so fast. Ki le'achar yamim im lo yitkaimu kol haklalim vehapratim b'viat hagoel hamitnabei alav isha elokim nafka amine chorva. He says, we better be careful, because if this is not the case, if he is not the Mashiach, great destruction will ensue for Klal Yisrael. We really have to be careful. Ve'achar kach, I hope am I reading where it's underlined? Okay. Ve'otam shelo nitkaima amitato. Afterwards, when people will see that this didn't happen, that it was all a fraud or a hoax, they'll say, Yomru she'ein Mashiach liYisrael. That they'll repudiate all of Messianic belief altogether. Shekvar achluhu b'yamei nevuat Aza. This is, of course, an echo of a Talmudic statement, she'ein Mashiach liYisrael, that there were those who believed that had already, in ancient times, during Melech Chizkiah, been used up. V'zeh, and he says that's the best we can hope for. If Shabtai turns out to be a fraud, the best we can hope for is that some people are going to say the whole messianic idea is fraudulent. וזה אם לא יכחישו דברי התורה והנבואה מעיקרם. But what about those who will say all of Yahadut is a fraud? If our own leaders could not tell us right from wrong in this vital matter, then what good are they? What do they know? Why should we rely on them for anything else? So let's be cautious, he says. And look how he has to defend himself. The afal pi at the very, those last lines in that first. Afal pi she'im lo hayiti ma'amin b'zeh ha'ish l'melech HaMashiach lo hayiti chotei. He has to say, don't consider me a sinner if I reserve judgment at this point. Kol od shelo ra'iti chezkato k'divrei harambam. And this, by the way, is his criteria. He says if the man lives up to the criteria which Rambam enunciated, which he repeats many times throughout Tzitzat Novel Tzvi in Hilchot Melachim, then I will believe it. And until then, I'm allowed to doubt it. And you have no right to accuse me of being a sinner or a doubter or a heretic or somebody who is blocking the Geula. I am legitimately in doubt until this person fulfills those criteria. Look at the response now, and here you'll get a little understanding of how it is possible that somebody in a leadership position, and this is not just any Rav, this is Rabbi Yitzchak Aboab, who was at this time one of the chief rabbis of Amsterdam. And he responds. He tells Sasportas why he thinks it's important for the Rabbanim to uphold this news of the Mashiach, even without confirmation, even though all the signs have not yet come. Okay. Look at how he addresses Sasportas in that first line. He says, Ra'inu ma shehirchiv peh v'herich lashon neged ha'emunah hazot. Sasportas' assembly did not fool him for a minute. He says, I saw how you opened your mouth. This is how he talks to Sasportas. And you cast doubt over our emunah. He says, how dare you do that? Be quiet and let the people believe. V'lo yateh et levav ha'am v'yani otam mitshuvatam. And this is the key here. What was happening in Amsterdam? What was happening all over the world when Jews heard that the Mashiach was on the way? The answer is they packed the synagogues. They gave charity like never before. They completely turned over. They became tzaddikim. They did maasim tovim day and night. This was a rabbi's dream. He says, I'm not going to let anything stand in the way of this movement of tshuva. It's fantastic, he says. Look what's going on here. It's bringing people closer. It's having such a profound beneficial effect that even if I myself, and he later at points admits, he says, I'm going to essentially adopt the stance of agnosticism. I'm going to wait and see. I'm not committing myself personally. But as a Rav, I think it's wonderful what's happening in the community. He says, Amarnu lahadrich et ha'am l'tshuva u'l'sayam. We're doing this because this is leading the people to this fantastic repentance movement. And he says, V'zeh eino mazik laTorah v'lo l'kabbalatenu. How can this be harmful? This is not harmful to our Torah and to our Kabbalah. Sasportas, of course, disagreed. Absolutely. Sasportas felt that only the gravest harm to belief in Torah and the tradition could come from the Chachamim supporting such a movement without further evidence.
Did this exchange take place before they were aware of Sephardic followers' desire to abrogate certain halachos and so on?
I think this is at the very beginning when the Shmuot first come in. Now there are, again, he does certain things even from his youth, but they were, as we said last time, symbolic violations, pronouncing the Shem HaMeforah. He had strange ceremonies with Sifrei Torah. They were not the kind of abrogations of the law that later come to be associated with nihilistic Shabtaot. So the answer is here, things are really very much in flux, and they don't know yet. As the nature of the movement becomes more open, the positions solidify. You either have to really go for the whole picture, or you have to stay away completely. Yes?
Mm-hmm. How typical was that of the mainstream leadership that some were anticipating, others were saying, well, we have doubts about it, but I can get my Balabachim to come to shul, and we have a shul, we have records, and when this movement broke out, people were saying developing constantly,
yes.
People were learning.
The answer is that there are three kinds of responses. Sasportas response is one extreme response. Absolute negation from the beginning until further proof was shown. That response was the dangerous way to go. Let's look at the case of another Rav. Look at the case of, in Turkey, of Aaron Lapapa, who was the chief rabbi of his community, who had his community so incensed. They were so angry at their Rav for not going along with this that they ousted him from his position. They cost him his job. We're going to read some other little descriptions of communal chaos and disarray. So that Sasportas had one advantage here, and that is the one we mentioned before. He didn't have a job to lose. And when you don't have a position to lose, when you don't have Ba'alei Batim to answer to, you can take extreme positions and be outspoken and say what's really on your mind. And this is something, by the way, that characterizes many of the anti-Shabtaim. Moshe Chagiz did not have an official rabbinic position. Yaakov Emden did not have an official rabbinic position. These people were free to be as outrageous and outspoken as they cared to be. They had no position on the line. We'll see more of that. That's not an insignificant factor. While we're on this page, I want you to look at one other thing. And that is the little, you'll have to do a lot of turning. We're going to have to turn ourselves upside down several times tonight. What I brought here is a contrast in style. It's a different type of polemical work. Sasportas, as you saw, gave as close as possible a line-by-line account of every piece of correspondence and every shmu'ah. He records it faithfully. What you have here is the very beginning of a polemical work called Sefer Merivat Kadesh, which was written much later, and I brought it here only really to show you the contrast in style. It's a polemic against a later Shabtai. We'll talk about him, Miguel Cardozo. He was the chief spokesperson of the Marano Shabtaim. Remember we said last time that there were some who said the Mashiach had to become a Muslim just as we had to become Christians. The Mashiach is a Marano like we are or were. Well, here you have a polemic against Cardozo, and look how different in style it is. And we're going to look at many different styles. Halo chalchu ha'etzim limshoach aleihem melech vayomru el ha'atad lechata meloch aleinu. Who is Atad? Unless you knew, you didn't know. It's a play on words. It means a thorn or a bramble, and cardo in Italian also means a thorn or a bramble. You would never know unless you were in. Who is even the villain of this piece? And it's written in such a heavily elusive style that it's almost impossible, again, unless you know what's being written about, to pick out or to learn from any historical event. We know that somebody hates somebody for some reason, but we don't know anything historical, who he was, what his name was, when he lived, what he did. It's a different style of polemic. We're going to look at this other style as well. I just wanted you to see it so that you could appreciate more what Sasportas has achieved with his method of collecting the original documents as close as possible to the form in which he either remembered or actually possessed them. Okay, we'll come back to a discussion of other styles, but I just wanted to put that there because it was a good time to sort of point out some differences. Also, if you want to have an amusing contrast in style, look at the very last page. It's chaval that I could not exhaust the patience of the secretary at my history department and Xerox this whole document for you. It's a satirical Haggadah Tisha B'Av. Now, Tisha B'Av, we said, was the chief holiday of the Shabtaim. They believed that Shabtai the Mashiach was born on Tisha B'Av. And in each column here, I took pieces of the Haggadah, which is familiar to everybody, and you can read how sardonically, how ironically, it's really absolutely hysterical, and there are several versions of this. This is written by anti-Shabtaim. It's making fun of the sectarian holiday of Tisha B'Av. Now remember, let's begin with the beginning. You have on the first column the Seder, the actual order, Kadesh or Chatz, that's why we call it Seder. Kadesh, making Kiddush. Yikach Mishichi Echad, let one Messianic Jew take et kos hatar ela biyado, the poison cup in his hand. V'yarim kolo ad sheyichanek, and let him raise his voice until he chokes to death. Every line of this is a parody on the instructions you find in the regular Haggadah. V'yomar oili ki nidmeti ki ish tamei sifatayim anochi, and let him say, woe is to me because I have been deceived and I'm a person of impure words. So v'toch am tamei sifatayim anochi yoshev, and oili ki Gurash, yes, urchatz. Well, I don't. Some of it is really dirty. It's sort of, yes. He says urchatz and washing. Let him urinate and let him give everybody. It's really angry. It really saves no dignity for the, okay. Now, again, much of this is a reflection of what anti-Shabtaim believed. They believed them to be very perverted people. They believed them to be very dirty, rotten, nasty people. And so this is sort of the Dayenu. Look at just at the end. If he had announced himself in public but hadn't led so many others to sin, Dayenu, that would have been enough for us to denounce him. Ilu hichshilam lachto v'lo hemir, if he had led everybody to sin but hadn't converted to another faith, dayenu, that would have been sufficient. And so forth. V'lo chilel et Hashem b'far Heresy. In other words, it's taking the standard Haggadah, and every single line of it is a parody, aimed as below the belt as possible against some Sabbatian practice.
What's the big thing?
The author is anonymous. It's a manuscript published by Aleph Mem Haberman. And this is long after this type of polemic is clearly from a time when Shabtaim had become a sect with their own calendar, in which Leil Shavuot is the very first date on their calendar, because that's the date on which Natan supposedly announced Shabtai's messianic mission. It's clearly from a time when things have gelled considerably. So even though I'm bringing it out of its chronological order, when we talk about anti-Sabbatian literature, we can't just look at the sober, historical, documentary type of material that you have from Esas Sportas. Of course, the two genres are married beautifully in the work of Rabbi Yaakov Emden, who both in a work like Torah HaKanaut keeps very accurate records, but some of his other work is really just beyond the pale. You can't even translate it in decent company. Emden, yeah, and in fact, there's a great deal of scholarly discussion over whether it would be proper to translate it into English, because it doesn't show him in a very good light. This is it seems like almost childish, schoolboy level, some of it at least, opposition. But there is a very wide range of styles available for the opponents of Shabtaim to express their outrage at the Shabtaim. Again, we can come back to that. You had a question? No. The Francis brothers? The Francis brothers have very interesting. The Francis brothers are Italian, and Yaakov Francis was a very well-known mishorer. He has a fat volume of poetry. And their opposition to Shabtaut comes on a completely different basis. The Francis brothers, who also wrote anti-Sabbatian, both Shirim and polemics, Tzvi Mudach, they were opposed to the popularization of Kabbalah. They were anti-Kabbalah in general, but especially let it not be disseminated among the masses. And the fact that the Shabtaim used Kabbalistic language and texts and thought as the main vehicle of their intellectual justification made the Francis brothers oppose it just on that basis. There are others who have that kind of intellectual opposition to Shabtai or to Shabtaut. You have somebody like Rabbi Yaakov Tzemach, also in Eretz Yisrael, who objected, who was a Mikubal himself, but he felt that the Shabtaim were distorting the Kabbalah of the Ari, distorting Lurianic Kabbalah, and opposed them on that intellectual ground. So there are many different reasons. Sasportas himself, for instance, was really more of a Chassid of Cordoviro's Kabbalah, which is pre-Luria, and may have also found something objectionable in the Shabtaim because they were Lurianic Kabbalists. So there's many such, and then of course we'll read Nieto. There are those who are rationalists who oppose the whole movement because it simply defies any rational explanation, and so forth. There was another question.
Many of the journalists of the 17th and 18th century learned to follow like the broad
Many.
The question is, how do you separate quote-unquote Orthodox Kabbalah from heretical Kabbalah?
That is the question. There is no answer to that. And that question comes to the fore. Wait for a few minutes till we talk about the Ramchal. Because there I think you see most poignantly in his own life and most blatantly that the issue is not even whether he was a Sabbatian or not, but what was a young fellow like him doing, claiming to have a Magid, claiming to have revelations, claiming to be writing great Kabbalistic secrets. The question isn't even anymore, is he a Shabtai or not? So the answer is, you're asking a very good question, which many of the anti-Shabtaim wouldn't even be able to answer. When Hajiz was pushed against a wall and said, well, what's wrong with Luzzatto? The only thing he could find, when you peel away all the rhetoric and you look at what the core issue was, the core issue, which you could sum up in a word, is Hidchadshut. He's claiming to have something new to say, something new to add to Kabbalah. That is his opposition, not the content of it, just the very fact that it's new, that he claims that it's revealed, already makes it dangerous. Because without new revelation, you don't have Natan's prophecy about Shabtai. So it all gets to what you have is a question over whether can there be saying the truth? And if not, what is that doing to the spirit, to the capacity for renewal in Klal Yisrael? Oh, I'll promise I'll continue. I don't, all right, we'll go on, but I don't mind the questions especially because we'll cover some of that anyway. At any rate. Let's look at one other. Look at page 2 before we go on. Some of these documents date before Shabtai's apostasy. Most of them from either right or considerably after. I'll give you for some of them the dates where we know them. What I want to paint for you here with these sources is a picture of the chaos within Jewish communities, the confusion. What are you supposed to believe? Who are you supposed to follow? To what extent are you supposed to be a champion or stick up for your own Rav? The very first, and again I apologize, this is really Kitta'im, which is how Sasportas characterized his whole output. The very first here is from a collection of letters published by Meir Benayahu. This one dates from Taf Chaf Zayin, the year after Shabtai's apostasy, the very first one on the right. And it's written by Shmuel Abohab, whose position during the Sabbatian excitement we already saw, he said, can't hurt. let them continue to believe as long as good things are coming out of it. And he's writing to the rabbi of Rome, Rabbi Yehoshua Menagin. Oh, you're right. No, this is Shmuel. Is that what I wrote here? I can't see. Okay, if that's correct, then I apologize. Shmuel Abuhab is a different figure who took a different stand. Kefi hanishma, I need to check. B'chol makom u'makom niflega haaretz likitot kitot. He says, as far as I understand, wherever you look in Jewish communities, everybody is divided into parties, into groups. V'deot chalukot, different opinions. V'kategoria mitzuya b'talmidei chachamim atzmam. And the worst criticism is being leveled against the rabbinic scholars themselves. Asher rubam shamru lefihem machsom, who watched their mouth, who kept a muzzle over their mouths, literally, who didn't speak out. Uktsatam tedunum lekaf zechut. Some of them we have to judge with generosity. Shena'aseh lahem keheter, that it sort of seemed to them as though it might be permitted, lehaflig ba'amitut hadvarim hamithavim, to exaggerate the truth of what was happening. Lema'an lo yitrapu yedei ha'am ha'asukim b'ta'anitam u'v'tshuvatam, so that the people who were so involved in their fasts and in their various penances should not be discouraged from that. The lo ra'ata ein chochmatam, and this is the criticism, that for all the fact that they were the scholars, they were the leaders, how did it happen that their chokhmah, their wisdom, failed them? They didn't see zot hapirtza hayotzet kahayom hazeh. They didn't see what a great breach, what a great void was going to come out of all of this. And in the wake of Shabtai's apostasy, there was bitter resentment. Where were our rabbis? Where were our leaders? How come they didn't warn us that maybe something bad could come out of it? How come they went out on a limb to approve? Okay, and he goes on and he says, thank God there were a few voices that spoke out in opposition. If not for those few voices, we would have no leg to stand on. That's one picture. Okay, look at the next paragraph below that. Another rabbinic exchange about what's happening almost immediately in the wake of Shabtai's apostasy. Atzar b'milin lo uchal, I cannot withhold my words. Milahodia lemar rov hachidushim asher ba'aretz hazot. Tamid hema ein l'chayom she'ein klalut inyanim meruba mishel chal. Every day something new is going on. There's confusion. Every day some new issue arises that we have to deal with. He says, for instance, Rishonah, V'ma she'ira b'yom Shabbat Kodesh, the Beit HaMidrash, or Beit HaKnesset. Let me describe to you what happened this past Shabbat. Davar gadol v'nora, something terrible. Bilbul gadol asher lo haya kamohu, confusion, the likes of which we haven't seen. Lemin hayom asher bara Elokim eretz v'shamayim, since the beginning of time, I have never seen this community in such an uproar. V'hishtomamti al hamar'eh, v'achaz libi platzot, v'hu al shelo kar'u l'chacham l'krot ha'aseret hadibrot. What happened was, it was the Kriyat HaTorah and the most important aliyah of the whole year, and they snubbed the Chacham. They did not call him up to the Torah. Kiyim la'am ha'aretz. Instead, they called an ignorant person. Ki chen yatsa hadavar me'et pnei ha'parnasim, because such was the decree that emerged from the Parnasim. The Parnasim are the lay leaders of the community, the ones who hire the Rabbanim. The Amadhu al Raglav Litboa El Bono. The rabbis stood up to denounce such an insult to his kavod. Al shehilbinu panav barabim. You cannot insult a rabbi in public in front of his whole congregation. V'chol ha'am lemiktanam v'ad gdolam yatzu nitzavim al anshe ha'ma'amad. When they saw that the rabbi did not willingly accede to this insult, the entire congregation now turned against the Parnasim, against the members of the Ma'amad. And so on and so forth. I'm not going to finish each one of these, but just again to give you an idea. Within the community, within each synagogue, here you see something else. It's not only one rabbi who disagreed with another, but sometimes, and again, depending on which congregation, you could have it go either way. Sometimes the rabbis were ma'aminim, and the parnasim, the lay leaders, were anti-ma'aminim, were anti-shabbat. Sometimes it was the reverse. And if the rabbi had a different opinion, if the rabbi spoke out against Shabtai, even after the events that occurred in 1667, the Parnasim could abuse him and even remove him from his position. And what were the congregants supposed to think? Confusion like this there has never been in the history of our Kehillah. Let's go down the second column. This is Sasportas writing. And here, in this example and in the next one, there's a practical dimension. It's not just a question of kavod to one person or to another. There's a practical dimension. In wake of the movement of Shabtai Tzvi, certain practices, brachot, were instituted, Birkat Kohanim on a weekly basis. Certain things were instituted, and then the question is, now that Shabtai has become a Muslim, should we keep on with those practices, or should we say the cause has been abolished, let the practice be abolished? And there's tremendous machloket among Rabbanim as to whether various traditions that began with Shabtai were good in and of themselves and should be continued no matter what, or were evil because they emanated from such a circle and should therefore be immediately abandoned. The very first paragraph here, of course, comes from Sasportas and comes from the height of the movement when they decided to abolish Tisha B'Av. יש לי ספק עצום ורב בעניין ביטול צום העשירי באזמיר בעיר גדולה של חכמים ושל סופרים. He says, I have great doubts whether it's right to announce at this premature stage the abolition of the fast, כי על כל פנים נראה כפי מה שנשמע שכולם הסכימו על זה. At first it sounds as though everybody agreed, all the rabbis agreed. ואם כן הוא אין לך אות ומופת על קיום אמיתת רוח השם הדובר בו יותר מזה. ונסתמה לא היו נשמעים למאמרו אם לא שנמסר להם אות. ולהכחיש הכל אי אפשר. He says, I believe that if everybody would have agreed to it, I would have had nothing to say. But then he goes on to say that I have heard that there were voices in Smyrna that disagreed with the imposition of this new decree, and therefore I must say that there are more. He says, I know myself in the second paragraph, יש יותר מ10 שנתנו כתף soreret l'gzerato zot. I know more than 10 people who didn't listen to this decree. Look at the next paragraph. Gam nish'ala she'ela. HaKohanim lo hayu nos'im kapehem ki'im b'yom tov. Originally, Birchat Kohanim only took place on a holiday, on a Chag. B'sibat habsorot v'hashmuot asher ba'u mishabtai tzvi nas'u kapehem b'chol yom Shabbat Kodesh. They had Birkat Kohanim every Shabbat. Now the question is, do we continue to do it or don't we continue to do it? Atak tzat anshe blial ratzu levatel mitzvat aseh min haTorah be'omram. And look again, it calls the opponents anshe blial, godless people. The godless people want to abolish the Sabbatian practice because they say, Ka'asher nitbatel hasiba, yitbatel gam ken hamisovev. Once the cause, Shabtai, has been abolished, well then, of course, everything that emanates from that should be abolished. The Zichro Yasuf Mizaro, there are those that say we should erase or delete every remnant, every zecher of this movement. And al zeh na'asu psakim minim shonim. Without going into the details of who was deciding what, this is something practical that divided a kehillah. Should the Kohanim be permitted to get up there every Shabbat or not? Just again, to give us a taste of the kind of controversies that were generated in each and every synagogue, in each and every community. So you have rabbis against rabbis, you have lay leaders against rabbis, you have lay leaders against lay leaders. Okay, I don't know how much time you still. Okay, if you look at the very next paragraph, I brought this here because this is a special tefillah. Hanoten Shua Lamlachim, which was composed in honor of Shabtai Tzvi. This specific one. I'm sorry, okay. מאותו היום ואילך התקינו לברכו בקול רם בבית הכנסת באימה ביראה כעומד לפני המלכות, וזה נוסח הברכה, as though he were a king. It's an old tefillah which they now have reconfigured for Shabtai. הנותן תשועה למלכים ממשלה לנסיכים מלכותו מלכות כל עולמים הקל הגדול הגיבור והנורא מלך מלכי המלכים מאין כמוהו. Let's look at Hu Yevarech, skip a line, V'yishmor v'yintzor v'yazor, v'yiromen v'yigadol v'naseh l'mala l'mala Adonenu, Malkeinu harav hakadosh, tzadik v'nosha, Hu Shabtai Tzvi. And Mashiach Elokei Yaakov, Yerum Hodo v'tinaseh malchuto. I do not want to, it was never my intention to draw parallels to any contemporary events, but they're too obvious. And if some of you were following the Chabad taped messages in the days shortly after the death of the Rebbe, which some of his followers still do not admit is a real death, essentially one tape said, in view of the fact of the recent events, it may no longer be advisable to use the term Shlita after the Rebbe's name. Now, Shlita, of course, means may he live long. The man has already died. And I don't know how it was resolved. I know that among the core Ma'aminim, whose circles I am not privileged to number myself among, there is still there is still acknowledgement in every ceremony, in every simcha, in every of his presence. Well, they still say Yechi Adonenu Morenu V'Rabbeinu Melech HaMashiach La'olam Va'ed. They have not stopped that.
He should come back, but not.
Well, that's your interpretation. As one interviewee said, we believed in him when he had a stroke. Why should a few shovelfuls of dirt change anything? Okay. We'll look at. He has a Nathan the Wise. He has a few Nathan the Wises. They're not so wise, and they're fighting over that. I think was his undoing. That he had so many very zealous spokespeople who still, some of whom still are waiting for his revival, his imminent revival and return. Again, the parallels are so fascinating and so strong. I must confess, when many years ago I was a beginning graduate student and thought I was working on some obscure messianic movement from the late Middle Ages, I never dreamed that I would see something so similar in my own lifetime within Orthodox, within traditional Jewry. And much can be said about it. I don't really, I think people can draw their own parallels, and this is not perhaps the best place to dwell on them. Look at one other thing, though, and that is the very bottom piece here. From a very interesting compendium, Maaseh Tuviyah is really the book, the diary of a 17th century doctor, a physician, Tuviyah HaRofeh, who writes all kinds of other fascinating things in this encyclopedic work that covers everything from the latest in medical technology in the 17th century, may God keep us far away from it, to the events that occurred, to the wondrous events that occurred in his time. And look at the heading. Look at just the few introductory lines to his section on the movement of Shabtai Tzvi. He says, Perek Shlishi Bo Yuvan She'ein Lehityaesh Min HaGeula. The main point I want to make, he says, when I recount these events is, it's important to remember not to be discouraged from the ultimate Geula, U'mibiat HaMashiach. Af al pi sheyitmamea nechakelo. Even if he tarries long, we'll wait for him. Ve'ein lintot ozen el ha'umot hamonin otanu. U'mevi'in ra'aya al orech hagalut u'mishichei sheker. We should not pay any attention to the nations of the world, and here he clearly means the Christian polemicists who look upon us and count the episodes of false messiahs among us. Shaba'u ad hena. Shezot einat ta'ana mukhrachat lehityaesh min ha'geula. The fact that there have been false messiahs, he says, is not a decisive argument against there being one day a true Messiah. Don't let the Christians discourage you. Don't let them use this episode to erode your hope in the future. And he goes on, again, we'll read just a line or two. Amnam masha ha'umot ubifrat hanotzrim, particularly the Christians, because the issue of the Messiah is so central to the polemic between Jews and Christians. Po'arim pihem livli chok. They open their mouths with great audacity and with no boundary. V'lo agim aleinu. U'mecharfim u'megadfim otanu. Ve'omram kol hayom. Ayeh efo malkachem hu melech HaMashiach. So where is your great Messiah that you're awaiting? And then they go on to use that opening to say, well, the real Messiah came long ago, just you Jews didn't accept him or didn't recognize it. And they use that,
How many was he, quote unquote?
very short amount of time. From the real announcements until after his Hamara was a few months more than a year and 3 or 4 months. Then he became a Muslim, and then he lived for 10 more years almost until his death as a Muslim.
Is there any allegations of him having performed any occult, any miracles, or anything?
Oh, many allegations, no proofs, but the rumor factory that accompanied his every step, much of which gives us a wonderful window into what 17th century Jews and Goyim thought would happen when the Mashiach came. If it wouldn't be so sad, it's wonderful to look at.
They're not claiming miracles, right?
Well, they claim certain types of miracles. For instance, to be able to look at a person, chochmat hapartzuf, and to be able to tell you everything about their soul from one look, to be able to read from their palms of their hands. That kind of, which you could say is not really a miracle. They also claim to have done other miracles, but less. I'll give you a very, jumping to the end. If you look at the Kamea controversy, which is the opening salvo in the Emden Eibschitz controversy, Jacob Emden accused Yonatan Eibschitz of being the author of Kameot, amulets, that had Shabtai's name in the formula, and of therefore being a secret Shabtai. Who got these amulets? What was their purpose? The rabbi never denied. Yonatan Eibschitz, who was the towering intellect of 18th century Jewry, never denied writing amulets. What was he writing them for? He's writing them for women who were about to go into childbirth. And this was believed to be, and probably was, given the sanitary conditions of midwives and doctors in those days, the most effective protection. If you open up his defense, the only thing he ever wrote to defend himself is a book called Luchot HaEdut. And it's absolutely mind-boggling. He doesn't say, I didn't write them. He admits he wrote Kameot. And he admits that they were given to women who were pregnant. He says, I'm going to give you the following affidavit in my defense. The year before I came to this city, when I wasn't here to give women kameot, he says, you can look in the cemetery, and I will have an affidavit from the Undertakers Society. 15 women died in childbirth. The year after I came and gave out my protective kameot, only 1 woman died this year in childbirth. He says, so are my kameot effective? Am I using the power of good? Or are you right and I am drawing from the power of evil? He says, forget everything else and let's look at the results. In later Gilgulim of the Sabbatian movement, miracle makers, Magidim, who would go from city to city and perform exorcisms and write kameot, what you might call the practical or magical aspects of Kabbalah, come to take an even larger role in what is associated with Shabtaut. The beginnings of Chassidut, by the way, are from those same circles. The Baal Shem, the very title Baal Shem, is somebody who had mastered the name of God for magical purposes. There were many Baalei Shem. What distinguishes this one was that he was called the Baal Shem Tov. Again, but magic is an essential component, and there's very fine distinction between a miracle and magic, and in the 17th century, medicine. It's all united. Medicine, science, alchemy. Even the scientists of those days were really not much different than what you would call magicians. Yeah. Well, that is precisely the issue. The answer is no. It had not been established. What constitutes nivu'ah? There have always been. I need only take you one or two generations back to Rabbi Yosef Karo, who had a magid, who didn't give him nivu'ah. He didn't proclaim it to the public, but did come to him in visions, which he wrote down in a diary, which we have, the Magid Mesharim. That is, again, all of this is still up in the air. And the question of Hitchachut Nevuah, which you already have in Spain before the Gerush, in northern Spain, very active claims, and sometimes it's couched in the language of Hofia Eliyahu Bebeit Midrashenu. That's a famous way of introducing innovation and cloaking it in the language of something that comes from on high and therefore cannot be challenged. Yes, despite all that, there were many, again, especially among the Mekubalim. These were mystics. These were people whose whole desire was to unify themselves with God. They didn't claim to be Nevi'im, but they sometimes claimed to have contact, sometimes in a vague and diffuse spiritual way, but sometimes in a very concrete way. Well, again, they called it many different things. But let's should we jump to Ramchal? You want to jump to that? No, I could go on. You're going to have to draw the line. The rabbi has to draw the line. Is that not the lesson we're taking away from this? What? Well, I'll let you fight that out. No, I'll say, remind me to talk about Aleppo, just a brief word, because I did. The Ramchal material is translated into English. It's on, I think, the 4th page, and this I took out. It's my own translation. Okay, let's say a word of introduction. Moshe Chaim Luzzatto was 17 years old when he first claimed to have a vision directly from a Magid who came to tell him Chidushim. And thereafter he had these visions fairly frequently. Among the things that resulted from these visions were a new Zohar and thousands upon thousands of pages of Kabbalistic material, some of which is still in manuscript, accessible in nearby libraries. In fact, just as a sideline, there was recently published a beautiful new edition of his Musar classic, because they found a new recension, a new manuscript that has different material. But he began to have the word spread that he was receiving these visions, and that he was, once every week or so on, he would speak to Kahal and tell what he had heard. And that was really the only information that his Rodfim, his opponents, had about him at the time that they began to persecute him. And here I use the word persecute. Persecute bears with it a rather negative connotation, that you're doing something which has no justification. I say that because they were rather careless, and of course they may have been right or wrong about some of the deep content of his material, but they didn't know that. All they heard was there's this young man in Italy who is claiming to have visions from a Magid. He's writing it down. And look at the first paragraph. What I had here, and we don't have to read, are two reactions. One was of a Raphael Kimchi, who was he was an emissary from Eretz Israel. The second he heard that there was somebody who was receiving messages from a Magid, he immediately said, he affirmed it. He used all the status that was invested in him as a Shaliach Eretz Israel. He immediately affirmed it. Many other Italian rabbis immediately felt a grave danger. Here, the Venetian rabbis were the first to open up the proceedings against him. Why? Again, perhaps Italy being in the shadow of the papacy, they were even more sensitive to such kind of claims. But this is how they react. The first sort of set-off paragraph. Are we to believe that the ancient sublime wisdom, and anybody who's interested, by the way, must get a hold of the edition of Igrot Ramchal, called Ramchal Uvenei Doro, which was put out years ago, but it's still available by Ginsburg. It's an absolutely wonderful collection. Are we to believe that the ancient sublime wisdom that has been hidden from all mankind has been restored through the Lord's illumination and influence? In other words, are we really to believe in Chidush Nebuah? This is the question. Or are we to assign him to the category of those who hold back the footsteps of the Messiah with their audacity? Is he one of those chatzufim? How dare he, with no preparation, with no reputation yet for saintliness or piety or scholarship, who is he even to claim to be a vessel for God's illumination? We'll assume that all the actions, our ways are misguided, and we will deal harshly with him. They're simply saying, on the basis of no further information than the very fact that he claimed to have a revelation, that he's no good, that he's evil, and that they're going to persecute him until he's quiet. Look at Hajiz in the next paragraph. And again, look at the strong language against someone who has later proven to have such an enduring spiritual voice. My anger, says Hajiz, is not directed against the abominable heretic. And he uses here the acronym Hamal. Again, he's using the most abusive possible terminology. For he has already left Klal Yisrael. He has forfeited his share in the world to come. We're not even discussing him anymore. He's beyond our ken. He's beneath contempt, but against his rabbi, Rabbi Yeshaya Bassan, and other scholars who have come forward to defend him, whoever does not condemn his work to the flames has enticed the public to sin. The evil has sprung from the distortions of his rabbi, Isaiah Bassan. Now again, Bassan was not a completely uncritical supporter. Bassan begged him time and time again to be more careful. But Ramchal believed that the phase of Geula that they were in, and he did believe that he played a role in it, could not be completed until the whole world shared, the whole Jewish world shared in his revelations. That, by the way, again, is something which you have later in Hasidut. You have to spread the word to the whole world. That's one of the preconditions for the coming of the Mashiach. And now look at a different approach, a different mahalach. The Bet Din of Frankfurt, Rabbi Popers and his Bet Din pronounced judgment on Luzzato's writing. A small portion were to be burned, the rest would be buried. The burning was those writings that were considered heretical and dangerous, the rest simply to be buried. That done, he pronounced the controversy closed. Now is the time to let the matter rest, never to be mentioned again, neither in writing nor orally, so that the scholars will cease their quarreling. What some Rabbanim felt was the ultimate at this point, and again, Luzzato's controversy erupted in 1730 and continued for several years. Shabtai Tzvi had been dead for over a half a century. Some people said, look what this has done to the image of the rabbinate. And many historians, by the way, believe that the controversy that erupted between rabbis and the stances that they took over some of the Sabbatian issues that we looked at, that this is what eroded traditional Judaism and led to the massive breakdowns that lead you to the modern era and all its movements. Well, right. You now have a question of whether proximity to events being near one another equals causality. That doesn't mean that one caused the other. But there again, there can't be any question that there's a tremendous amount of rabbinic contention. So much strife, so much controversy. Could that have been good? Zionism. Again, the question is, can you prove that? Some historians like to see the movement of Shabtai as a sort of precursor of Zionism, and that Messianism is a movement of Jews against the Galut. And Zionism is a movement of Jews against the Galut. But the fact of the matter is, I would disagree with that. Messianism is really the most traditional expression of hope to end the Galut, and Zionism is a true break, modern Zionism, with tradition. So I would not agree with that. But historians have seen almost everything in modernity somehow related to Sabbatianism. It's acquired an importance way beyond probably its actual historical importance. Professor, tell you about Aleppo. I only want to say one word about Aleppo because it stands in such distinctive contrast to the picture we drew of contention and strife within communities during the movement of Shabtai Tzvi and thereafter. The Rabbanim of Aleppo, during the time of Shabtai Tzvi, had been the Rabbanim of Aleppo at least since the beginning of the 17th century. This was the Lanyado family, who numbered among their members illustrious rabbis, the author of the Kli Yakar, really scholars of the first rank. When the rabbi of Aleppo met Shabtai Tzvi, Shlomo Lanyado, he was convinced by him. And the one thing that distinguished the community of Aleppo from all the others is that they seemed to have followed their rabbi unanimously. When the rabbi said, follow, there was no contention, or so the picture that remains seems to be. They never, there was even after Shabtai's apostasy, there was never a movement in the community to remove him from his position. He was revered until the end of his days, and there doesn't seem to have been that kind of internal communal strife in anything that I found. I also want to mention one word about Laniado's place in the documentation. It seems that Shabtai Tzvi opened himself up to him and told him many things about what he believed about himself, about his own, Shabtai's own relationship to God. He called himself Mashiach, Mashiach Elokei Shabtai Tzvi. He had a very personal relationship. In fact, he believed that was one of his contributions, that Rabbinic Judaism had become so distant from people having direct relationships with God, and he, Shabtai Tzvi, was going to restore it. And Laniado was so taken with him that he recorded these memoirs or interviews, and that remains one of the important primary sources for what Shabtai believed about himself. And anybody who wants to see it, it's only 2 or 3 pages. In volume 7 of the periodical Tzion, Sholem published Laniado's document about Shabtai Tzvi. They again, at the height of the movement, they were all followers. They were all ma'aminim. And in the aftermath, it seems as though there was still, it took a long time for this glow to die down, but the community does not appear, again, from what I've seen, to ever have been rent by that kind of sichsuch that most of the other communities were, which I thought was fascinating.
Was there any apostasy?
Not that I know of. Not in Aleppo. It was a very important center at the height of the movement for disseminating news throughout the Middle East.
Do you know of any reference that, this might be a little bit too specific, but if any reference that refers to changes in the Nizaf or the halachot or whatnot of?
I honestly don't know. It's not too provincial. It's just. It's certainly possible. It's not too provincial. It's just beyond my own knowledge. Many, a good portion of what we've looked at tonight, especially in the first generations of opposition, come from the Sephardic world. Just as some of his greatest supporters were from the Sephardic world, so were his greatest opponents. Hasportas was a Sephardi. Hajiz was a Sephardi. Some of the most important on both sides, it plays itself out. It doesn't really move to Ashkenaz until the 17th century, when for the first time in 1725, you had, in the 18th century, until in 1725 you have a sort of reawakening in the Ashkenazic world, where you have young yeshiva boys who are traveling through Central and Eastern Europe with manuscripts, Sabbatean manuscripts, and people appointed to check their luggage when they stay in hostels overnight. But that's in 1725. It becomes a later import, more or less, into Ashkenazic. So once, of course, it gets planted in Ashkenaz, you have the movement of Jacob Frank. No community has a monopoly either on beliefs in Shabtai Tzvi, on the extreme, sometimes perversion based on this belief, and on opposition. You have it both in both worlds, first in the Sephardic world, because after all, Smyrna was mostly Sephardic, and Shabtai Tzvi's first followers were almost all Sephardim.